Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all of our lives. Some organizations in New Mexico say they are very concerned about how state and federal programs have left out relief for immigrants. Here to discuss a report that highlighted the issue is New Mexico Voices for Children Executive Director James Jimenez. Mr. Jimenez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate this opportunity.
Now, I want to dive into this report and discuss it, but at first I think it's important that we acknowledge so many things that are happening right now. We have the COVID-19 pandemic, which has also led to a major economic downturn, not only in our state, but across the country and the globe due to non-essential businesses closing and the fall of oil and gas prices. And most recently, we have major unrest across the country due to police brutality and racism. Now, there's so many things that are happening right now, but I'd like to first start off with giving you an opportunity to talk about your organization's mission.
Sure, thank you. Well, New Mexico Voices for Children was founded 32 years ago by pediatricians who believed that the best way to address child well-being in New Mexico was for there to be a voice in the public policy space, meaning that they created this organization to lift up how children were doing in New Mexico and to present research-based, evidence-based solutions for improving child well-being in our state with public policy makers. We now call those things the determinants of health, and so we've been working on those for 32 years. In New Mexico, of course, because 75% of our children are children of color, we have to do it with the knowledge that not all of our children have the same kinds of opportunities to thrive. And therefore, racial and ethnic equity have become very much a central part of the work that we are doing at New Mexico Voices for Children to see how we can actually provide better opportunities for all of New Mexico's children to thrive.
Now, the report titled Essential but Excluded discusses how immigrant communities in the report say are left out of relief from governments, both state and federal. What are the major concerns that you have with this report that this report shines light on?
Well, the report came about because we have some really great community-based organization partners, one of which is right there in Las Cruces. It's called CAFE. Their executive director, Joana Bencomo, has been a partner of ours. And she, as well as Marcela Diaz from Somos un Pueblo Unido, and Rachel Lazar from El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, and Javier Martinez from Partnership for Community Action, we all got together and started talking about, once the federal CARES Act passed, who was being excluded. And it was really evident who was excluded, and that was immigrant families, those that don't have documentation. That it was very problematic because we know that many of the workers that are on the front lines providing the basic services that our families need are in fact immigrant workers who may or may not have status in terms of residency, or they may come from mixed status families. And we believed it was really important to illuminate just exactly who these families are, number one. Number two, we need to know, the public needs to know that it's not like these families are not paying taxes. They do. They pay almost $400 million a year just in state and local taxes. That's very significant. And that we as a state and we as communities have a responsibility to make sure that the needs of all New Mexico's families are being met because they've been left out of the Federal CARES Act.
Now, you bring up a point there about immigrants in our country, in our state, contributing to the tax base. Can you kind of give us a better example of how they exactly do that? Because I know there's a lot of confusion around this issue.
Sure. I mean, just think about any worker, right? virtually every worker out there, unless they're being paid cash, and there's probably not too many of those, as they earn money, taxes are being withheld from their paychecks. But what do they do when they get their paychecks? They go out and buy food, right? They rent houses or they buy houses, and so they're paying taxes then. They consume other goods and services. They buy vehicles for transport. They buy clothes. All of the basic necessities of life are taxed in New Mexico, except for food, thank goodness. But this means that immigrant families are paying the full range of taxes that everybody else is paying, whether they're property taxes, income taxes, or our gross receipts taxes.
Now, you certainly bring up ways where immigrants may contribute to the tax base with their purchasing power, but what about with the workforce? What about our local economy? How do immigrants in New Mexico and across the country play a role there?
Well, I mean, just think about it. We know that immigrant workers in some industries have a very high presence. That can be in the tourism industry, right? Which we know is absolutely one of the most important industries in New Mexico. In the oil and gas industry, we know there are immigrant workers in the oil and gas industry. We know that in the construction industry, that immigrant workers are working in the construction industry. So if you think about just about any industry in the state, it has immigrant workers working in it. So immigrant people have been a fundamental part of our New Mexico economy from day one, and they continue to be.
Obviously, COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives in various ways. What are some of the unique challenges that immigrant communities are facing right now with COVID-19?
Well, too many of our immigrant families are not eligible for the kind of assistance that other workers are. Healthcare, right, is the one that comes to mind first of all. That's particularly problematic because we know that many of these workers are essential workers, meaning that they have continued to work all through the pandemic. We've seen some really awful stories, some even from southern New Mexico, about businesses that did not provide the proper protective equipment for their workers. And we've seen spikes in cases in various places. So I think that the challenges are certainly around healthcare, but they're also around the preventive measures that people need to keep themselves and their families safe so they're not spreading it throughout the community. We also know that with respect to immigrant workers, too often much of the information that's been provided in the past has not been provided in languages other than English. That has changed fairly recently, but that didn't happen by accident. That happened because of organizations like CAFE and SOMOS and El Centro and Partnership for Community Action and others advocated with state government to make sure that as much information as possible was being translated into Spanish and other languages. So that language barrier has been a pretty significant one that we've been real intentional about trying to address, and not just for the immediate term, but really for the longer term, and so that immigrant families can understand the kinds of services that they may be eligible for.
Now, with the pandemic, information and getting that information is in a timely manner can be essential to really helping stopping the spread of a virus like COVID-19. What about the immigrant community? Is there a major time lapse with getting information to the immigrant community in regards to what they need to know to prevent the possible spread of COVID-19?
I think that there had been. We hear that it's getting better, and we rely upon our partners on the ground, to provide us that information. And I think that the governor and the governor's staff have been more intentional about trying to get that information out. There still is a bit of a lag, though. It does take time to translate this complex medical jargon into the Spanish language, right? Yeah. And it can be a little problematic. But I think that from what we're hearing from the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services, that they are making a much more intentional effort than maybe they were a month and a half ago.
Now, there's so many issues that with just getting the information in regards to medical jargon that you just mentioned. What are the restrictions at the state level, at the federal level, that may be hurting immigrant communities with this situation? Are there any?
Well, let's start at the federal level. I think that that's the best place to start. The state of New Mexico received $1.5 billion under the CARE Act to help the state recover and deal with the unexpected expenses that were coming from the pandemic. That sounds good, yes, but there's a caveat. One, the biggest caveat is that people who were undocumented were not eligible for aid under the CARES Act. The expanded unemployment insurance that was provided to states, people who were undocumented did not qualify for that. Not only is that morally wrong in my mind, but it's also economically just dumb, right? We know that immigrant workers make up over 10% of the working population here, and that New Mexico is going to come out of this double pandemic and low oil and gas price recession that we're in. We've got to make sure that money is getting into the hands of average New Mexicans, irrespective of whether or not they are documented. That means if we can do that, that money could flow in towns big and small, into businesses big and small, as people spend that money to keep their families alive and to keep themselves fed and continue to consume. Anthony, 70% of the nation's economy is driven by consumer expenditures. That's how important consumer spending is to the national economy. And that's true here in New Mexico too. So it's vital that we continue to get money into the hands of average New Mexicans, because we know they'll spend it in businesses large and small. So that's the first problem at the federal level.
Well, let's talk about the federal level though.
Sure.
How do you see that being addressed? Because even if you do have the congressional delegation on your side fighting for the changes that you want, what do you say to people who are in opposition of that, who don't think that that is necessary, who cite that people need to obey the law and issues like that? There are very many reasons. There are really a lot of reasons why people voice their opposition against that. But I mean, what do you tell folks who disagree with you so that they can understand that this is an issue that all of us face?
Sure. Well, I think in Voices for Children, two things I would say. One is some people we're probably never going to convince. But there are other people, I think, who are good-hearted people who just have some concerns about immigration policy in our nation and our nation's inability to adequately deal with it. But there's two things that we can do. One is make the moral case. We know that there are some real valid reasons why people flee their home countries. People are just seeking safety. They're seeking to live. They're seeking to protect their families. So I think that the moral issue can resonate with some people. Other people, I think, can be swayed by the economic argument. We know how significant immigrant workers are to our workforce, and that if we are going to thrive as a state, all workers need to have money, they need to have support, they need to be able to support their families. Otherwise, we are going to see all kinds of industries being really significantly harmed for a very long period of time if immigrant workers don't have the ability to support themselves and their families. That's not going to be good for New Mexico. So I think that there's both a moral case and I think there's an economic case to support the position that we are taking, that immigrant workers need assistance too.
Now, obviously here in New Mexico, lawmakers are going to have to meet in a special session to really address the budget concerns due to the drop in oil and natural gas prices in the state and how that has affected the economy. What are you hoping that lawmakers consider when they go to address these issues dealing with the budget?
Well, there's two things. One is that, as I've said already, that we believe that the recovery is going to come when people have money to spend, to create the demand for goods and services that businesses need, right? And they can only do that if they have money to spend. So we think that that's vitally important. We only have to look back to the 2008 to 2018 recession when New Mexico did just the opposite. We took an austerity approach. We cut and slashed our state and local government budgets in a way that turned out to be really harmful for the recovery of New Mexico. And in fact, we were one of the last states to recover from the Great Recession because of that. We think we need to take just the opposite approach, where we need to make sure that the average citizens, average residents of our state are getting money into their hands to be able to create that business demand that keeps open those businesses, whether they're the large retailers or the small mom and pop shops that exist out there. So
How do
that's the
they,
first thing.
how does that happen though? How do you get that
Mhm.
money into their hands to jumpstart the economy?
There's multiple ways that we can do it. One is to make sure that we don't start cutting back on the state government workforce. State government does employ over 20,000 people all across the state of New Mexico. Not all of those people are just in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. They are in communities large and small all across this state. And we need to keep those people employed. Think about the teaching workforce, right? It would be a real shame if we had to start cutting back on the number of teachers or teachers' assistants or cooks or custodians. Those are good, stable jobs that exist all throughout the state of New Mexico that need to be supported. That's why we can't go to an austerity approach. So that would be one major thing. The next major thing would be is to provide assistance for those who have not been beneficiaries of the Federal CARES Act rebate dollars. So figuring out a way again to get money into the hands of people whose job may have gone away, possibly forever. How do we support them? We need to have a stronger, a better unemployment system that recognizes that the workforce today is substantially different than when these unemployment programs were created 50 to 75 years ago, and that we need to make sure that gig workers, for example, can benefit from this and know that they have the support to continue to struggle through in these times. So I think that there's the direct support for children and families. There's keeping the workforce going, and that keeps the money flowing through these economies. And I think that the state and local government has a unique opportunity to continue to support the economy like that for the next year and a half to 2 years. It's going to be vital.
Some states have passed laws and made emergency funding available for immigrant communities. I'm thinking of California as one. Do you think New Mexico could possibly do the same, or do you think the budget issue may be too much for lawmakers to really put themselves out there politically to take that action?
Well, one would hope that the doing the right thing by New Mexico residents is going to be first and foremost in their mind, and hopefully that will be the case. Number one. Number two, there are ways that the legislature can do it. We believe it is legal to use the CARES Act money to do direct support for undocumented folks through various programs. And if in fact it's not, I think that there's ways that the legislature can and should, as part of a recovery package, find general fund dollars to use to support undocumented families. So I think that there's ways that they can do it. Again, like you said, is the political will there? Hopefully it will be.
I've talked to a number of lawmakers and folks running for office this year. One of the major things that came up was addressing New Mexico's tax system and calling for tax reform. How does your organization feel that issue should be addressed?
That's a good question. Well, the first thing that always comes to mind when I hear people talk about tax reform is that just a code word for tax cuts. We would hope that that's not the case, because again, we point back to the 2008 to 2018 time period when what did New Mexico do? We slashed taxes on business based upon the promise that it would somehow magically create thousands of great paying jobs with benefits for everybody. Well, it was a dismal failure. It absolutely did not work. So what we think needs to happen is we need to make our tax system more progressive. And what that simply means is that those of us that earn the most should pay more than those that earn the least. We think that that's only fair. We think that's a smart way of making sure that New Mexico state government, as well as our local governments, have the opportunity to provide the kinds of services like healthcare and education that we know are at the heart of a strong economy.
Some lawmakers have proposed bringing back a food tax to bring in some sustainable revenue to communities. You mentioned at the beginning of this interview that it seemed like you didn't favor that. If that is so, can you explain why you think why you're against that?
Sure. We do not believe that imposing a sales tax on food is good public policy, period. And the main reason is that it unduly harms low to moderate income families. We just think that there's much better ways to raise money. The people that want to reimpose the gross receipts tax on food only want to limit the conversation to that. Well, we would remind lawmakers that they considerably cut the personal income taxes. The benefit of that overwhelmingly went to the highest income earners. We would also note that they dramatically cut corporate income taxes. The largest benefit of that went to wealthy out-of-state corporations. So what we would say that there are ways to raise money that is sustainable over time, but we don't think that taxing food is smart public policy, particularly in a state that is so high in food insecurity. And that simply is kind of techno jargon for the fact that people don't have enough money to put enough food on the table all month long, particularly children.
If you don't have some sort of sustainable revenue for the state, though, with this food tax, I think about rural communities. How do these communities really generate some revenue if they don't have a food tax or some sort of sustainable option for communities that might not be able to land a major company or grow a business because they don't have the workforce? What about those communities?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, Anthony, because I was a city manager here in the Albuquerque metro area for many years, and I know that we were overwhelmingly dependent upon gross receipts tax revenues to support the basic services that we were providing. So I very much understand the challenges that communities large and small face in that. My answer to that would be that is where the reform needs to come from, right? That is the essence of the reform. We need to figure out a better tax structure that allows both state government and local governments to generate the money that they need. We know that some of these communities, as you pointed out, the very small ones, maybe the most important business in their community could be the grocery store. So I think that there are ways that, and the way that we've structured the gross receipts tax on certain purchases like grocery stores, those items still are taxed. It's just that not food bought for consumption at home is not taxed right now. But I think that is an area that the legislature legitimately needs to think about a reform.
Now, you brought up the grocery stores and you've talked about food insecurity. Obviously, many folks in New Mexico are dealing with that issue right now. And I've talked with folks at food banks. They're really concerned about places in the state that maybe haven't been able to keep their pantry open due to the pandemic and have struggled to really get food in places where it is needed. How big of an issue is this not only for immigrant communities, but New Mexicans in general?
Well, Anthony, this is an issue that makes me crazy. The fact that the richest country in the world can't figure out a way to feed its population, it's really criminal, I think. It really is. And it is a very significant issue. It was before the pandemic, and it's gotten even worse now. I know that, for example, that we are involved with Representative Melanie Stansberry, who's a representative from the Albuquerque area, who is working on a proposal to present to the legislature that would provide a significant infusion of dollars to support the pantries all across the state of New Mexico. This has to be long-term support because I don't think that we're going to come out of this recession anytime soon. And the job, it looks like the nature of work can be changing a little bit, right? It's not clear that everyone's going to be able to go back and work the same kind of schedules and earn the same kinds of income that they did prior to the pandemic. So it could be a long time that we need to be able to figure out better, smarter ways of supporting families. What I just heard on a call earlier this morning about really interesting things that are happening in certain parts of the state, and that is where farmers are coming forward with food that sometimes they can't sell, and they're actually donating it. In some respects, that's not fair to the farmers who are having to put out money to grow the food that they're donating. So we've got to figure out a better way of supporting those farmers, big and small, in the state that can help us feed our population in ways that I think need to be different going forward. And that is some of the work that New Mexico First and Representative Melanie Stansbury are looking at statewide. And it isn't just food, it's also water. We've seen the lack of potable water in southern New Mexico, but also in northern New Mexico.
And how that plays out in fighting the spread of a pandemic like COVID-19. Obviously, that's a major issue. I just have about a minute left, but I want to give you an opportunity to let our viewers know where they could find out more information about this report, Essential but Excluded, which highlights the issue of immigrant communities possibly getting left out of relief for COVID-19 with the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you give us an information on where folks can find out that report?
Sure. Your viewers can find it at our website, which is www.nm, as in New Mexico, nmvoices.com, .org, nmvoices.org. Yeah, that's our website. And not only will they find this report, but there's any number of other reports that we've done on things like food insecurity, for example, that we've talked about today. Tax policy and how that impacts the state's ability to fund the programs that we need for children to thrive.
James Jimenez is Executive Director for New Mexico Voices for Children. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we want to thank you for watching Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.